Well, welcome to the Outdoor Art Club for the Public Speaker Series. We're glad you're all here. Thank you for your understanding. We've got a lot going on here today. As you can see, we've got some construction over here and a huge collection of things that we're gathering for our estate sale. The preview party is Wednesday the 29th in the evening. It'll be wine and hors d'oeuvres and a chance to get a peek at all the things that are up for sale. And then the actual sale is the 31st and 1st. So we hope you'll join us. This lovely object is one of the things, and as you can see, there's lots of stuff that you can go for. So the speaker series is what drew me here to the Outdoor Art Club about 7 years ago. I've learned so much about our community through these engagements. The speakers have enlightened us about local history, art and culture, environmental and conservation efforts, and bring our attention to nonprofits that are working to strengthen our communities. The speaker series is the gem of the OAC, or one of the gems. So on behalf of the Outdoor Art Club and the Civics and Conservation Committee, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Sarah Allen, marine ecologist, who will share with us some insights about what's shaping the future of our national parks. A few notes before we get started. The presentation will be about 45 minutes. There'll be 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A, and then we hope you'll stay afterwards for some homemade cookies and tea. I want to start with this quote of Sarah's that I love, that reminds me of what I appreciate about scientists, their perspective on the vastness of life and their sense of humor. So reflecting on her experience following a scientific expedition in Antarctica, Sarah noted, "The scale of Antarctica made me realize that I was a sesame seed on the rye bread of life. I saw how small humans are on the larger landscape, but we have a big footprint. As conservationists, we look at how that footprint is manifested. We look at multiple things to see how they tell a story. Science is the search," this is my quote, "science is the search, sometimes painstaking and tedious, for the underlying story, also known as the truth." So Dr. Sarah Allen earned her Master's of Science and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in Wildland Resource Science. She attributes much of her career inspiration to the encouragement she received from some amazing mentors, including Starker Leopold, the son of conservationist Aldo Leopold. Sarah spent over 25 years with the National Park Service in various positions within the Pacific West region. During her 15 years at Point Reyes National Seashore, she started the long-term monitoring program for pinnipeds, think sea lions. She served as science program lead for the Pacific West, which included identifying and leveraging science needs for parks from Washington to California and all the way to American Samoa. Sarah was responsible for matching early career UC scientists with park science needs. In her own words, Sarah was fulfilling a passion inspired by her mentors. "I was lucky in that I had mentors that encouraged me and showed me how to make an interest into a career. Now I want to give back to the next generation. I put all of my energy into creating clear pathways for those to pursue science." Throughout her career, Sarah both worked and volunteered at conservation organizations, including 15 years at Point Reyes Bird Observatory, now known as Point Blue Conservation Science. She's authored and co-authored over 100 publications. She co-authored the UC Press published book, Marine Mammals of the Pacific Coast. Sarah is known for her passion about using science to inform the public and guide land management decisions, particularly as concerns about our changing environment continue to emerge. Today, Dr. Allen will share stories about how managers are collaborating with scientists and other partners to preserve, protect, and reimagine parks for the future. A paradigm shift is underway for the 21st century on managing our national parks. Parks are no longer restoring ecosystems to some past vision of the 19th century, land and seascapes, but restoring processes under uncertain weather and climate patterns. So please join me in congratulating Sarah for her recent retirement from the National Park Service and warmly welcoming her to the Outdoor Art Club. That was long, huh?
Now we're just shaking. Well, thank you very much for that long introduction. And okay, there you go. And I really appreciate being asked to come and speak to you. I've been in this space before, but it was a long time ago, and I feel at home here just because Berkeley has a lot of buildings like this. And I have a lot of friends here, which is a surprise to see too, so I appreciate that. And to speak before you, because you have a long history, your organization in conservation itself, which I'll speak to in a minute. As was described in my introduction, I want to talk to you about these changes that are happening in national parks from their inception, because we have a long arc of conservation in the Bay Area specifically, but in the National Park Service broadly. And I love this image. It's painted by Laura Cunningham, who wrote a book called State of Change. And she speaks to the changes that have occurred in the Bay Area, and she describes it so well with her artwork. And this is looking at the Central Valley a long time ago. So there, it actually worked, the clicker. Okay. And imagine what Marin County may have looked at 250, 300 years ago, where there may have been grizzly bears and Redwood Creek in Muir Woods feeding on salmon, which would have been abundant. Or this image she also painted of a gray whale probably washed up on the Point Reyes beaches and grizzly bears feeding on them. Grizzly bears were a primary, not just a predator, they were a scavenger. Their presence was large in Marin County in the past. But we're not going to recreate this in our period. But if you go to Yosemite, you have an inkling of that feeling. If you were out in Yosemite even today and you were at Glacier Peak, Glacier Point, looking out over the valley, you'd have that sense of vastness and openness and wildness that would have been in Marin County 300 years ago. Again, we're not going to recreate that, but have that sense of wildness, and that's the basis of what national parks were established for. And this is the mission of the National Park Service: to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein. And that's not wild animals, that's the wildness of life itself. And this is the mission statement written in 1916. So they had that sense of wildness still. So the first national park was actually Yosemite, and it was initiated by Lincoln, President Lincoln, in the 1960s, before he died, 1860s, before he died. And he turned it over to California, which then, as a new state, and then it eventually became part of the national system again. But I like to think of Yosemite as being that first actual national park, that wildness of things. And then your role, your organization's role, your founder's role, Lauren White is her name, and I read this on your webpage. So if you're not familiar with it, dig down deep. Strong ties to conservationists. And I had always thought that William Kent was the reason why Muir Woods was a national park. But in fact, it was Lauren White who convinced him that this was an important area to preserve for conservation, to preserve the redwoods. And William Kent was a senator at the time, and he was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt. So he wanted to be in good terms with Teddy Roosevelt, as did Leland Stanford, who turned over Pinnacles, his lands, became a national monument. These were in the early 1900s, the early national monuments. And so Muir Woods was one of those first ones. So kudos to you guys and your founders, because you're part of that long arc of conservation and understanding the importance of wildness. So many of my mentors, including E.O. Wilson, who I interacted with a fair amount because he was a very staunch advocate of national parks and the importance of preserving wildlands. And he wrote a book called Half Earth, which I think I indicated would be a good read for you. He doesn't go into the science so much as the feeling of wildness and why we need to have wild places. It's part of who we are, that we are not disconnected with nature. Nature's part of us. We co-evolve with all of these different species and these landscapes, so we have a bond to these different landscapes. And that's his argument. And then preserving for our future. So I'm going to go into a bit of that, but just a little teaser there on his role. Wallace Stegner said that national parks were America's best idea because it's the essence of democracy. It's the people's parks. And each park, when you look at them across the United States, and every state has a national park or national monument or some protected area, it's part of our history. Whether it's Muir Woods as part of that history, or San Francisco Maritime in San Francisco, or John Muir National Historic Site, which is also part of the San Francisco Bay Area. These each have a part of our history and who we are. And not all of the history is a good history, but we have to remember it. Some of them are pretty tough to go to. An example is Minidoka, which is a national historic site in the desert of Idaho. And this is where the Japanese were interned. And I went there one time and I sat in the heat of June, in the hot, hot heat under a little tree. And I had a sense of what it would have been like there. The silence was amazing. And it's a wild place, and it's part of our history. And it gives you a sense of both the positive and the negative of where we've come from as a nation. So just a little teaser on that. So national parks are, as I said, they're not all wild places. Some of them are war memorial areas. Some of them are recreation, like Golden Gate National Recreation Area, but they all have wild pieces to them. Even Antietam, the landscape of Antietam is amazing as a National Historic Site. So early scientists weren't really paying attention to the needs of wildlife. Wildlife was recreation. And the roots of the research that was done for national parks really was started at UC Berkeley. The first superintendents were trained in Hildegard Hall at Berkeley in the 1920s. The first wildlife biologist, George Wright Menendez, was trained at Berkeley. Grinnell surveys were initiated out of Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in Berkeley. But this is how they treated bears at Yosemite initially. This is not how they're treated now. But there was this myth that you had to get rid of the predator. And if anybody read Sand County Almanac, which was written by Aldo Leopold, you know that this is not, he went through this period of understanding that predators were an important part of the system, that you didn't want to take all your predators away because then all you would have is deer. And the deer just eat down the trees. And they learned this pretty quickly after they started monitoring in these areas. And then fire was suppressed and is still suppressed. So in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, prescribed fires were first introduced in the 1960s so that the sequoias could resprout. They weren't resprouting, they realized it was because there was no fire in the system. And then the understanding about what happens with catastrophic wildfires. As I digress a little here, but I had a talk in mind to you that I was not going to go into the fire area because of what we experienced in the past week, but I folded it back in, and so I'll talk a little bit more about this. But this is a history that we are still carrying through, and that's one of the things that you understand about conservation. We have ideas about how things should be managed, and then we realize, oops, we've screwed up, and we need this paradigm shift. And that's part of what's happening now, is understanding about how important fire is in our system and not be afraid of it. We also had this shift in the 1960s, and that was with Starker Leopold, who was Aldo Leopold's son. He was hired by the National Park Service as the chief scientist. He was the first scientist of the National Park Service. And he was asked to write this Leopold report, how do we manage wildlife, because it's so out of whack with no predators and too many deer or elk or whatever where you are. And so this is a quote from that document: the need for parks to recognize the enormous complexity of ecological communities. We're still in the dark ages of understanding how ecosystems function. We know most of the parts, but we don't know the microbial parts, the microbiome parts of our ecosystems. And we're still learning, but just recognizing that it is complex, and we have to work towards studying that complexity in more detail and not cut it back. So that's a plug for continuing science in these protected areas. Some of the challenges that came out of the work that Starker-Leopold initiated was monitoring in national parks and understanding what species were in what parks and how they were affected. And looking at predators was a big component of that. So this is Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's a national recreation area, but it has these large predators in it. This is a famous mountain lion. I think it was in National Geographic, and it's been seen in all sorts of media. I think he competes with some of the stars of Hollywood, which you can see on the hill there. But when they started studying this mountain lion and more mountain lion population and bobcat and coyotes, they realized there's a genetic difference between those animals on one side of the freeway and those on the others. They're actually genetically different because the freeways were a barrier to their exchange and their breeding. And you probably heard of a special mountain lion in Green Park. Well, he was isolated there, but he was one of the few that was actually able to go across Highway 4 and go to other lands. But each of those dots in different colors represent different individual animals that they were tracking. And there's a very strong line between the south and the north. So that's a big challenge for national parks, as they're isolated by development and isolated by structures. Another huge challenge is just how do you balance enjoyment and people coming to national parks. This over here is Half Dome, and each one of this is people. These are people climbing Half Dome. I went up Half Dome in the 70s, and there were only 4 of us at the time. But this is more and more. You have to get a reservation to go up Half Dome now. That's the sort of level of use that's going on, and it's harder and harder to find those quiet places. So how do you manage parks with that in mind? And then how vulnerable are these parks to changes in climate? And this is studied in more detail now, but in this map here, the red color is the amount of change in biomes. So the biomes have changed over the past century. And the red is the more extreme change, and the green is very little change. So some of these areas have high, it's mostly based on temperature, but as the biome has changed over the past century. And a good example is a study done by a researcher at UC Berkeley looking at the shift of birds in Death Valley and some of the other parks. So he was revisiting sites that Grinnell surveyed 100 years ago. He went back and surveyed these sites, and he saw a shift in where the birds were occurring, both a shift in latitude and a shift in elevation because of how the biomes have changed. We wouldn't know that if he hadn't been studying it, but it gives a window into it. And just studying the Muir Glacier and how much it's receded. So these are elements within parks that are being studied over time to show how things are changing and to inform managers of how can we deal with it. We're not going to stop the glacier from going back, but we can deal with shifts in biomes in different ways, which I'll address in a minute. So this is coming into the next shift in informing how we're managing national parks. And I say how I'm a retired, so I'm not telling them what to do. Just be clear on this. And these are based on my experiences. More than 20 years ago, this document was put forward as a paradigm shift on how we manage parks for the 21st century. And this is 50 years after Starker-Leopold wrote his piece. The world is even more complex. It's more dynamic, and it's more stochastic in the events. An example is the wildfires that just happened, or the big storms that we had in December that I suffered with big trees blowing down with 70-mile-per-hour winds. So these are very dynamic times. How do you manage protected areas with that in mind? So they call this revisiting Leopold because he's held in such high esteem. So what I want to do is to give you 3 stories that I think best present what that mental paradigm shift is. And it's not a straight arrow, it's not black and white. It speaks to the complexity of what parks are experiencing. And I could have pulled from a whole number of different parks as examples. And in fact, I went back and forth about one because of the fire issue that just went on. And I decided to stick with this because I feel that you need to hear these things. You're part of this community on Mount Tam. So these are the 3. One is the condor recovery. A condor, an iconic species that has a vast landscape that it covers, where people are excited about a large bird, larger than life, prehistoric, and harks back to that wildness of when we were. I'll also talk about the Jacquemin wetland restoration that's in Tamales Bay, not so far from here, but it's a window into the complexity and how you have to adapt in your management strategies because things aren't what you think they're projecting to. You always have to monitor to see if you're going to have to change your methods. And then finally, One Tam, which I'm assuming there are people in this room who are part of One Tam. Yes? Yeah, I can see that. Because I know this is an engaged community with One Tam. So I'll speak to One Tam for you. And I love this picture of Bay Nature, but I love that one better on your wall. I grew up with the Mount Tam, in my view, grew up in Kentfield. So to me, it's an iconic landscape. So first the condor, and these pictures are by friends of mine who studied at Pinnacles National Monument. And again, here's a painting by Cunningham, how she envisioned condors amongst the sequoias in the Sierras. That was part of the historic range. Again, they're the largest bird in North America. I think their wingspan is 9 feet. I remember hearing about them as a child when I was visiting down in Central California and they were still wild. They were still in the wild. But that didn't last long because their numbers were decreasing so much. I don't want you to read all the dates here, but just have a sense. This is over 50 years of this happening, of changes. Their historic range well into BC, down into Baja California, and now their current range, very patchwork of just a few places. And the reason for just a few places is because that's where they've been reintroduced. So the recovery plan, 1975, I remember going to meetings in the late 1970s, and people were against taking the last wild ones into captivity to raise them. It was a big fight in Audubon about doing that, and yet they did it. That's what they did. They took them all into captivity. They raised them in captivity out of Santa Barbara and reintroduced them throughout California first. Then in 2003, they were introduced in Pinnacles National Monument, which is now a national park. And to me, that was a very exciting period because I was peripherally involved with it and working with the people, and I worked in the regional office. It was very exciting to see these. I stand next to the animal. It's that high. You know, these are enormous birds, and you feel like you're in the presence of they live 60 to 70 years, so you're in the presence of an intelligent, sentient being. It's a very moving experience even to see one in the sky is a moving experience. So now their population is built up, and this past year they were reintroduced into Redwood National Park with the Yurok tribe. This is really exciting. So this is landscape level conservation amongst Redwood and National Park and the state park and the Yurok tribe. And this name, Pregonish, and I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but that means condor in Yurok. They don't have it as a separate name to mean something else. That's their name. So they're important in their history and their culture. And I remember talking to a Pomo elder who had been involved in the Larkspur dig, where I forget the name of the nursery, but there was a nursery next to Redwood High School, and they found 900 graves there, right? And they had to, 900 graves they found from the Miwok village there. And in one of the graves, he said there was a condor. And the condor skeleton had an old break in its wing, so it had healed. So this condor had been obviously an important part of that person's life. He kept it alive for a long time. And it gives you a window into how important that condor was to that village. Just a, that's right, the Newman property. Niven, right, Niven. You remember that 900 graves. It was shocking. Actually, that was protected. The grave sites were protected. So here's the challenges are primarily that you get such a low population size that you have trouble with reproduction for species. And what's remarkable about what's shown up with condors is they'll do a trio where they'll have 2 females and a male. Usually a female lays an egg every other year. They mate for life. Well, this is a trio for life. So the male, each female hatches an egg every other year. So they're raising a chick every year. The females alternate the years. So the 3 of them, the male and the 2 females, raise that chick. And so they've got to have success with 3 adults raising 1 chick. You can imagine, it's probably overweight. I don't know. So that's a window into how they're adapting to low population. So that's one challenge. Other challenges are lead bullets, which are now banned in California, but you still can buy them. Hunters can still buy lead bullets from out of state or bring them across the line. But the point is to phase out, just like for ducks. Lead buckshot was phased out. Well, now we need to phase out. This is a big deal because what happens is condors they're carrion eaters. So they're eating carrion that's been on a ranch land, a dead pig or something else that's been shot, or guts, and they'll eat that, they'll get the lead, and then they get lead poisoning. It's not just a problem for condors, it's a problem for eagles and other scavengers, but because condor population is so low, it's a big deal. So getting the lead out of California is really important for their survival. Their potential impact in the last big fire that happened in Big Sur, there was concern about, in fact, they did lose some condors because of that fire, but there was a chick that survived and it was in a tree, right? These old ancient trees in Big Basin where they had a nest. So this is a way of adapting, either in caves where the fire could not get in the cave, or in these big trees, they're able to successfully raise a chick, even in lands where there are fires. So you see how they're adapting. Okay, that's my first story. And I want to leave you with a sense that condors are here and they're building up their large landscape. They have challenges, but I think these are challenges that we can surmount. They've lived here hundreds of thousands of years. Give them a little space, they may be very successful. So Giacomini Wetland, I'm assuming many of you have been to the Giacomini Wetland if you've been to Point Reyes at the headwaters of Tomales Bay. And this was targeted as part of a restoration work under Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It was a wetland previously, then it was diked and filled and turned into grazing land and a dairy ranch. There were levees. And here's the timeline. Over a period of 30 years, this area was restored. First, it was a concept that was identified. Then you have to get the funds to do the restoration. That came out of oil spill restoration funds during the Cape Mohican was a large oil spill. There were funds that were made available to apply to restoring this wetland from that. And then They had to have a willing seller. This rancher was willing. He was ready to retire, so he retired and sold his ranch to the park, and then it was implemented. And so now it's 15 years later, and you can see what was involved. So here's what it was in that dairy ranch, and here it is restored where the dikes were broken, the levees broken down, and no channelizing. There was some scraping in certain areas, and it's a restored wetland. So there was extreme, amazing transformation of the vegetation. So you have salt water coming in to where you had grasses, and so the grasses died back. Many of the grasses were non-native. So now you have a patchwork, a mosaic of native species to wetlands. And some of the dominant ones are just salt marsh grasses. But you can see the complexity just easily between the one on 2003 and 2018, a transformation of that wetland. And that transformation, that's 560 acres. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it was 4% of the wetlands in California. So it shows you how much wetlands been lost. And this just shows you very simply the increase in shorebirds. And just in the year after, 11,000 ducks were counted that came into the wetland. So here's shorebirds also. But again, things are not stable. Wetlands are dynamic. So you have a big overshoot, and then you get a kind of a stable wetland, and that's the period we're going through now. It's kind of stabilized. I go out there and survey shorebirds, and I don't see the diversity of shorebirds, but what I do see are rails, black rails, and Virginia rails and snipe, and those are the birds that are in these habitats, and they're very constricted habitats, but they're rare species, so rare species in rare habitats. So this is what it looks like now, and you can see the range of here's the main channel that used to be there. They tried to recreate that, and this is a area that's higher ground and lower ground. What they realized that this is not going to be able to, or when they modeled initially, they didn't take into account sea level rise. So they modified. So flooding actually was not a problem the first couple winters with flooding, but they felt like they needed to model for what would happen in the long term for both floodwaters and for salinity. Look at this. Here's bald eagles are already there now. You make, they will come. So here's what the model looked like for sea level rise. It doesn't take into account runoff because you don't know what sort of level of runoff you're going to have. The blue is what the sea level is going to rise to, 3 feet, which is projected 3-foot sea level rise. This is a levee road. The brown is upland. The blue is lowland or water. And you can see the main channel, that's still part of the habitat, but the sea level rise is not going to affect the infrastructure. For example, Levee Road. This past 2 years ago, there was saltwater intrusion into the town of Point Reyes because of there was a drought, and so there wasn't enough freshwater runoff, and so they were starting to tap into the salinity of the wetlands. So that was an issue that they hadn't projected for. And so the solution was the North Marin water tapped into Lagunitas Creek higher up, so that it's not in the salt wedge area. But it gives you an idea. You have to adapt to these changes. So that's that wetland and restoration, and again, ending with understanding that you don't have a perfect example and you have to modify, monitor, and adapt and work with the community in that. So that was North Marin Water, that they had to work with and make sure that the community had fresh, non-saline water. It was a big deal. For a couple months, people were getting bottled water because they couldn't drink it out of their tap. So my last example is Mount Tamalpais, which is iconic, and to all of you who live here and to me who grew up here. And this represents a different way that parks are managing lands. It's managing in partnership with a larger landscape with other land managers. So you have Marin Municipal Water District, Mount Tam State Park, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, but also Point Reyes National Seashore, Muir Woods, and then private lands that surround the area. So this is a community of people involved, and those in this room understand this concept better than I. I worked on one TAM on the periphery to help advise on certain things. But this is, I want this as an example for you to understand this is the direction we should be going. Parks should not be isolated in the landscape, that we're working across boundaries with other land managers. When I first started working with the Park Service, we'd have one park here and one park here and no connectivity. So you're managing in isolation. And most of the things that we deal with are not isolated in these little pockets. They move across landscapes, false fences. So part of the science that was involved in monitoring is one, what occurs across this landscape. So they set up a grid of wildlife cameras just to document what species occur here. And this is just a bobcat and a badger, but I know they've picked up lions and bears and all sorts of things. Volunteers and interns are going through all of these thousands of pictures. And anybody in this room part of that monitoring? Yeah, oh, you? Are you? No, that's great.
No, several years ago.
Uh-huh. Well, anybody who's flipped through pictures knows it's a long, tedious task, but then you get that gem. You get that lion.
You get a lot of moving grass.
Yeah, that's why it's 700,000 pictures. It has a motion detector camera, so it picks up that. But just understanding what species where across the landscape is really important. And you can identify individual animals by their pictures, too. They might have some certain marks on the face that you can then see in another place. For example, there was one-eyed Jack, mountain lion. He was seen in Nicasio. He was seen at Point Reyes. He was seen on Mount Tam. So here's one lion that had a huge range, home range. And then there's this, part of the reason I was changing the talk is because this document that came out, the One Tam Forest Health Strategy. People familiar with this strategy? Just came out. I recommend that you download it and look at it because it has a vegetation map that covers all of Mount Tam, all the land managers, and they go through identifying what strategy to approach for what areas in managing forest health. So this isn't one park or two parks or three parks. This is the whole landscape, including MMWD, and it's going to affect those who live around Mount Tam. So I encourage you to look at it. It's easy to download. I didn't have the time to really drill down. The thing is several hundred pages long. Anybody look at it yet? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Again, it's based on one vegetation map, high resolution, one database. And this is just one page that I took out, understanding about fire. This is why I said I drilled down more on fire, because I thought this would be meaningful for you. In understanding with fire suppression, you have catastrophic wildfires because you have that building up of fuels. And that's what we've done, all of us living around Mount Tam. We've all done that. This is dealing with thinning or changing that landscape so that you reduce the risk of a catastrophic wildfire. And the map on the left shows you the high fire risk area and what hasn't burned in the past 70 years, all of that red is Mount Tam. That hasn't burned in the past 70 years. I've been involved in 2 wildfires in Point Reyes. One was the Vision Fire, which was in 1995, and then the Woodward Fire that was just recently. There was another fire since then, but you can see there's been a change in that projected landscape. But if you go out to Limantour in the Vision Fire, remember 1995, it already looks like it could burn up again just at the same level because it's based on vegetation that is fire-loving vegetation. Our bishop pines don't reproduce unless they're burned. So there's a fire-loving tree. So how do you manage for that? So what I appreciate is this document really drills down, and it can in detail. So here, I just took one little snapshot from the document, and this is Lake Lagunitas, Bontempi area. And I'm sure you're familiar with that. You're on the hiking over Mount Tam. So you see what areas have a wildfire hazard are the high red areas, and what needs to be addressed. This is the desired future conditions here and how you would want to manage it. I don't want you to look at specifics, just understand that you have what your target is, where you want to manage an area, what you're managing for, whether you're reducing fuel load or you're protecting infrastructure, how you would address it, where you would address it, and then who's responsible, and how do you go through that process. This is very complicated, and we don't even really know how, over time, how much you would have to repeat that effort, but it gives you a window into how we might deal with this catastrophic potential wildfire for where we live. And what we want is something like this, where fire would go through, and this is a thinning process where you would actually mechanically remove things in a thinning, or you could use prescribed fire for thinning. And this is, once you get an area thin, then you can use fire back in the landscape for what is effective. Use it as a tool for reducing your fire risk. The fires down in LA, when it hit the Woolsey fire boundary, it stopped. So where you've burned before, you can protect an area. The same in South Lake Tahoe. There was a big burn there last summer, and it stopped in an area where there had been a previous burn. So prescribed fire on a large scale is a scary idea, but there are different ways to target it. And I think we have an opportunity to be engaged here to do it. We have a forest health plan also for Tamales Bay State Park, and so I'm trying to be involved with that approach in how we help reduce our fire risk, because a catastrophic wildfire affects all wildlife, all plants. You get type conversions often, so you have one type of vegetation can flip and be another type of vegetation. So this is a way to put more resilience back into your ecosystem without having catastrophic changes. So I want to I'm probably running over, but forgive me. I want to just wrap this up and emphasize the things in commonality with these examples that I've given you, and I could have given you tons of them, but the main ones to take away is that you want large ideas. You have to recognize that it takes a long time to get these ideas up and running. And we don't always have the luxury of time, but if you have iconic things such as condors or a mountain, that you can wrap yourself around that and move it forward because people get excited about it. You're part of the community. You're not isolated from the community. That you have to monitor and adapt and synthesize the information that you have, and that we have to pull up that next generation. When I was in high school, I have 2 high school friends here. When I was in high school, there was a biology class, and he actually had us going out in the field and doing stuff. And I actually helped a college professor in Bolinas Lagoon. That was a really important step for me. We need to multiply that so that many people have that opportunity at a much younger age. So we may not have this, but we might have this. We might have black bears in our backyard. And indeed, they're already here. They're already showing up in singletons. And we can help them by having some connectivity over freeways so they don't get run over. And this has been done down in Southern California. It's done all over Europe to help large animals, preserving special areas and then being with bears. This website is really excellent. The group that's working is helping Marin County managers live with bears. So you might want to have her come and talk to you. She's really excellent, talking about how we prepare and make space for bears, because they're coming, just like condors, they're coming. I hope that in my lifetime I see condors at Drake's Beach eating a dead gray whale. Now this picture, these are condors up here with a couple turkey vultures. See the difference in size? So this is in Big Sur on the beach. They love dead whales. So I love to necropsy dead whales, but this is really over the top. So the last thing I wanted to imagine future is, and that's why I wanted you to read this book, Half Earth, is setting aside lands specifically for those species that need those larger landscapes or even smaller landscapes, those special ones. And the target for California is 30 by 2030, 30% of the lands set aside by 2030. We're already way up there just because we've got big parks and big Forest Service lands. These big chunks are all protected federal or state lands, but our coastal waters woefully underprotected from extraction. So in my lifetime, this was one of the areas that I felt was important to protect. It's Drake's Estero, and it was part of the marine wilderness. It's the only marine wilderness on the west coast of North America, south of Alaska. And a marine wilderness, that's with a capital W, means no extraction of any type. So this is a highest level of protection. And now perhaps we'll see something like sea otters there because they need that higher level of protection. So that's my iconic species. So if you have any questions, I'll be very glad to answer them, and thank you very much.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was a little surprised you didn't talk about pinheads, which is like a big part of your career. So I have a question about the mountain beaver, and it's a lesser known rare species that was heavily monitored after the Vision Fire in 1995, and I didn't really hear much about it for a long time at all. Even after the Woodward Fire, there wasn't a lot of discussion about monitoring it. So I was wondering if you could expand on it and let us know a little bit more about what's going on with that species.
So the question is about the mountain beaver, which my husband calls a mythological beast, because you never see it. It's always underground. It's not a beaver, and it's not in the mountains. It's at Point Reyes, and if it weren't all within a national park, it'd probably be a listed species because it's so rare. During the Vision Fire, which occurred in 1995, there was a researcher who worked in the park at the time, and he was associated with the USGS, and he studied mountain beavers, and he knew where most of their colonies were. But then the Vision Fire occurred, and he realized that he had way undercounted because all the vegetation was burned away, and he could see where their burrows were at the north base of hills in very dense vegetation. So all that vegetation was burned away. And so he said that it was probably a total mortality because they're shallow burrows, and they're an ancient animal. They require water all the time. Their kidneys are very primitive, and they require drinking water continuously. So there was no vegetation, nothing to eat. So they probably died of starvation and dehydration. However, by the time of the Woodward fire, they'd repopulated because that monitoring was still going on. And then in the Woodward fire, there was mortality associated for the same reasons as happened with the first fire and the Vision fire, but a lot less area burned compared to what it was before. So their population's healthy, they're being monitored, but they're also studies in physiology because they're just so interesting. They're an ancient rodent. They have very primitive teeth. They're what are called haymakers in that they cut vegetation and then they store it in one of their burrows for drying and eating later. They have multiple chambers in their burrows for different uses. They're really interesting, but my husband's sure they're a mythological beast.
Would you care to comment on the policy of suppressing the barred owl population in favor of retaining habitat for the spotted?
The question was about suppressing the barred owl in protection of the spotted owl. So this is, again, I don't work for the National Park Service. I don't represent the National Park Service. I studied spotted owls very intensively for a good part of my career. And I worked with some of the researchers who studied them up in Olympic National Park and other national parks who saw the spotted owl disappear from their ranges because of the expansion of barred owls. So no more spotted owls really in Olympic National Park or North Cascade or Redwood National Park. They have been crowded out by barred owls. And barred owl, one of the theories is that barred owl expansion is because of the fragmentation of habitat. Spotted owls like dense forested habitat for nesting and feeding in, and barred owls don't, they benefit from fragmented habitat. So I am of the feeling that intervention is important to protect certain species where we've already messed up. We've already messed up areas and caused a decline on species. I would like a better way than lethal removal. I think that there are other ways to do it, but that's not my choice. And this is where ecology is no easy answers. It's not black or white. So right now, this is the southern end of the range of the northern spotted owl. This is their last holdout in any healthy numbers. You can go to any canyon in most of Marin County and you can find a pair of owls. It's pretty extraordinary. It's pretty extraordinary. And they're a pretty amazing bird. I'd hate to see them blink out here. Thank you for asking that question. It's a perfect example of the difficulty we have as land managers on how you act like God in deciding what species survive and what don't.
You might give a smaller example of that actually was carried out at Point Reyes, and that was when the introduced deer, fallow deer, and others were eliminated. This was what 15 years ago? Because
Yes.
of their abundance, they were brought in by farmers for hunting purposes. That's kind of a good micro.
Yeah.
We've done it.
Yeah. That comment has to do with a non-native deer that were introduced at Point Reyes in the 1920s, 30s. I can't remember the date, but they were from the San Francisco Zoo, and they were introduced for hunting at Point Reyes, fallow and axis deer, two different species, and they were competing with the native deer and with elk, which were reintroduced at Point Reyes, and they were damaging the habitat. And there were various paths that the park tried to help reduce the population, but it was very difficult to keep them and expensive to have to remove excess deer that were not native there. And so the park put forward an elimination of the deer through lethal removal and through it was the birth control, but it wasn't just birth control, it was sterilizing the males. Those were the different methods for doing it. And I was on the periphery of this, but involved. And I remember going to a public meeting with some people from Bolinas who are really tied to the fallow deer. And this one person felt, this is important in my life. This white deer has a really important place in my heart. And I listened to her and I empathized with her, and I really felt that this was a painful thing for her to have to see. And I recognized that these are not easy decisions. These are life-changing decisions for a lot of people. But the deer removal has been a benefit for the landscape and for the black-tailed deer, which were really being quite suppressed by them at the time. And now there are no more fallow or axis deer. And it's 15 years later, and people don't talk about them so much except Nona Dennis.
Well, the interesting is at that time, the organizations that oppose that are WellCare, the Humane Society, whose object is to save animals, individual animals, and the other approach, which is to save ecosystems or endangered species or what have you. So that will come up again, and already is with the case of the barn owl. But it's always something you have to anticipate, that people's emotions run back and forth. We all care about individual animals. We take little birds to WellCare to take care of them. So we have, that's a concept that goes on and on.
Yeah, it's a tension. It's a tension. I mean, even in this book, it talks, recognizing individual animals and respectful of individual animals, but also recognizing that if you lose this species, it's no longer part of our larger community, and there will always be that tension. Yeah. And it's good that we have those conversations, that you be respectful of individual animals. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this outlook on it. I'm involved with the Mill Valley Seascapes, and we are hoping within just the next few weeks to make an application by city cooperation also to remove the obstruction for, it's a temporal barrier to fish migration at Old Mill Park. And so I hope everybody will agree that it would be wonderful to have more time, more levels of water that the fish can migrate up and spawn. And it occurred to me recently that, in thinking about your talk, that climate change is going to mean perhaps fewer chances, lower water in our streams. And so removing this barrier that was put in by people, I think is in line with your thinking.
So not a question, but I appreciate the comment that removing barriers helps the system. It makes it more resilient. So not every year is a dry year. You have big flood years too. So, and I love that you're talking about a barrier for a stream. I'm thinking about Nicasio Reservoir and that barrier and that dam where no salmon are going up that. Even if there was a way for salmon to migrate up, that would be a big deal for that stream. Or Klamath. Klamath is a done deal. Klamath is a done deal. And look at the salmon are already there. Read about the Elwha restoration in Washington State, which had tremendous recovery of salmonids because of the removal of 3 dams there. Yes, hi.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Allen, for this informative and engaging presentation. I wanted to get your perspective and opinion about the historic land use change up in Point Reyes in the dairy ranches.
Okay.
Care to comment on that?
Well, I can't comment on the specifics because I don't know the specifics, but I can talk about the landscape change. Point Reyes was established as a national seashore in 1972, got the funds for it, but actually it was in the 60s that it was conceived. And it was during the Kennedy administration. It was the last thing he did was sign that legislation. And when it was conceived, is my understanding, is that the ranchers would be there for a period of time. I don't know what that time was. I wasn't there then. But I have talked to the people who were there then, and it was to be a limited time period. And they were bought out, but it's a right of use and reservation is what it's called, to stay for, actually it was different from that. But it was a time period. They were paid for that time. And so that time came up, but the park was not managing the ranches at that time. And so there was no push, and there was no willingness to push them out, is my understanding. At that time when it would have rolled over, instead it was just extended. So their lease was run out, and then it was just extended without leases. And you can't manage a ranch if you don't have a lease. You can't get a loan from a bank. So they were trapped in a financial situation where they couldn't get the funds to keep their ranches in good shape. So it's an economic loser for them, and it's both sides don't benefit from that. So I feel that the Park Service failed the ranchers and failed the park when that transition happened. And I don't know a date of that or how it happened. This is, again, my perspective. And so they've been bought out again, and I think that it's a good thing that the elk now will be able to range on the lands where they used to range. There were, when I retired, 5,000 elk and 5,000 cows and 500 elk. So a big difference on effect on the landscape with those two things. Two numbers. Cows, dairy cows, have a heavy footprint on the land because of water quality. And I don't think they've ever been able to grapple with that well, because the manure is spread over the fields, and the ponds are lit. When you have heavy rains, the ponds fail and leach into the water system. I think with beef cattle, they're more like a functional equivalent of an elk. And so they eat the similar things. So a transition from beef to elk would be a good transition. But this would be a little vignette of where elk used to range. They were almost extinct, another iconic species. They're the smallest elk, Tule elk is. And now I think there are maybe 3,000 in the state. Don't quote me on that, but their number is about 3,000. There are multiple places where they occur now, but Point Reyes was one of the first places where they were reintroduced, and it's in wilderness, capital W, wilderness land. So you have this sense of wildness about what elk used to range in. And I would like to see that in my lifetime. And I'm not unsympathetic of the ranchers and the workers, because I feel that this should have been resolved a long time ago. Oh, that's my answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that made me want to go back to school. I don't know anybody that enthusiastic, passionate, and knowledgeable. So it was just really fun to hear about future collaboration, and that's really the idea of the parks. So please stay for some tea and cookies. I want to mention, reminder, come back for the estate sale on the 31st and 1st. And our next speaker event is on January 23rd at 1 p.m. It's by Zoom, and it's sponsored by the Cultural Arts Program. They are hosting Rand Selig, author of Thriving, How to Create a Healthier, Happier, and More Prosperous Life. So we hope to see you there. Stick around for some cookies. Thanks.